Hello, welcome everyone to another episode of Joy Recovery Radio. I'm here with my beloved wife, Jacqueline.
Hi, everyone.
This is a tough topic today. We're talking about triggers. I feel like we should start with some gratitudes.
I love that idea. You want to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
We had a date night last night.
We did.
And the reason it happened is because in the middle of the week, you said, I need some time with my husband. And I am so grateful that you recognized that our coupleship needed that. It was a real shot in the arm for both of us. Really enjoyed it last night. But I'm grateful that you put such value in our coupleship. You protect it, you invest in it. And I'm grateful to you for that.
Thank you. When I learned about the infidelity, I remember saying, Lord, let there be a reason why I'm going through this. Turn this pain into purpose. And so I am so grateful that we are where we are today, serving others. And I couldn't do this alone. So I really appreciate that and how you geek out on this stuff. And I do. I'm really grateful because this sort of work is healing to my heart.
It has been curative for both of us. It really has been.
Yeah.
So let's talk about triggers. Let's begin. I'm going to share a clinical definition.
Okay.
And then I want you to get more into trauma triggers because we're going to talk about men and women today. They both face triggers. What we're not going to talk about is the triggers that sometimes refer to men feeling triggered to act out.
Yeah.
Temptation. I prefer the term temptation.
Yeah. I do too.
So we've already dealt with that both in episode 3 and 4. So people can listen to that to understand more about temptation and how to navigate that. We're talking about emotional triggers, and men do have emotional triggers. Women have emotional triggers and trauma triggers. And both men and women can have triggers that really go back to some wounding that took place before there was ever infidelity.
Right.
So there's various kinds of triggers that can happen, but let me just share just a very clinical definition of what is a trigger. So it is any kind of stimulus. And when I say stimulus, that means any of the 5 senses.
Okay.
Any of them. Some kind of stimulus.
Yep.
That evokes a strong emotional response related to some experience that often causes the person to relive. Okay. Now, that's more of a general term of what is an emotional trigger. Talk to us about a trauma trigger in particular.
I would describe a trauma trigger as the direct result of trust being broken by someone that you love, someone that you didn't expect that trust to be broken.
So if I understand right, a relationship begins between a man and a woman.
Mm-hmm.
She decides to trust him at some point with her heart. There may or may not be vows, but there's this shift that happens where, let's say 6 months in, she reaches this point where I entrust my heart to this man.
Yeah.
It's vulnerable, it's risky, but I'm doing it. I trust him. And let's say 5 years later, she finds out about infidelity. The trauma timeline goes back to that moment 6 months in.
Yes.
Where she gave her heart to him. And anything along that timeline can be a triggering
Absolutely
episode, a memory that is now tainted and now could be a source of trigger.
Triggers are the direct result of trust being broken. So if we're looking at a timeline, all the events that occurred when you solidified the relationship or you committed to the relationship and you gave your heart to this person, all of those events following that are now tainted because trust was broken.
So in a very real way, the longer the timeline of trust was from the moment of trust, giving this man my heart, to the moment that I realized I've been betrayed, the longer that timeline is, the more content there can be.
Yeah, couples that have been married longer or together longer have more recovery and healing to do because there's more fragments in the relationship.
And as she receives the truth, and hopefully she does, hopefully
Absolutely.
the betrayer honors her of the truth. Now she begins to realize, oh, you were doing this when our first child was born. Oh, you were doing this on our 3rd anniversary. Oh, you gave this gift to an AP on Valentine's.
Right.
And now there's more content that the brain can draw from to trigger her.
Absolutely.
And she's not choosing any of that. It's happening against her will. But the longer there's been a timeline of trust, and that timeline is now tainted,
Right.
now there's more content for the brain to draw from to trigger her.
Yeah. It's a broken reality. And then we usually find out that the sex addiction started before the coupleship even formed.
So I know you've looked into the frequency. We've looked at it anecdotally with betrayed partners in our recovery community. But you've also looked at your own frequency when you were in early recovery, and you've looked at some of the literature too. What do you think the range is? What's the average frequency that a betrayed partner in early discovery experiences triggers?
There's been a lot of research on this, and I actually have done my own research where I just kept a little sticky note. And every time I had a trigger, I would just put a line on that little sticky note. And then at the end of the day, how many lines were on there. And when I did that, it was the first year after discovery, and there were 126 little lines on there.
Per day.
Within that, I think it was 14-hour time frame.
Waking hours, yeah. And then even at night, more nightmares frequently, flashbacks, even night terrors sometimes.
And I don't think I recorded those. And I didn't record flooding events either. So the domino impact where one trigger or one reminder leads to another, then another, then another, and you're just stuck
Flooded.
on the hamster wheel, running through all of these memories. And actually, it's not even remembering, it's reliving, because there is a visceral reaction to that. So studies have shown that betrayed partners will experience 4 to 9 triggers an hour. And I think the research is spot on, honestly. But I do want to provide hope with that being said, because while 126 triggers is a lot in a day, what can help reduce those triggers is providing safety for the partner. What is going to promote triggers is abusive behavior. Like if you're stonewalling, if you're gaslighting, if there's manipulation, yelling, harsh words, blame shifting, trickle truths, partial disclosures, all of those are going to magnify the trauma triggers, probably times 5. Now you're going to be in a state of constant trauma triggers. And when I've heard some of the men say, oh, she's pain shopping or she wants to stay triggered, I can assure you, no one wants to have these reminders and relive this. Not one person, because what it does to you physically is really devastating.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about the neuroscience about that.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and get into that? I know we have a couple of different studies that we've looked at on what happens inside the brain. I'll go ahead and share as far as what I understand happens in the brain, and I'm going to put it in the most simplistic terms possible. But we're talking about 2 parts of the brain in particular, the back of the brain, the front of the brain. We're going to call the back of the brain the lizard brain. We're going to describe the front of the brain as the wizard brain. Lizard brain is your fight or flight response. Wizard brain is your executive function. When you feel safe, you're in your wizard brain. You and I, we're in our wizard brain right now. We have high flowing executive function. We can problem solve. We can remember certain facts and figures and stats and things like that. We feel safe. We can have a normal, productive, healthy, rational, logical conversation. That's wizard brain. In between those 2 sections of the brain is a gatekeeper called the amygdala. Its primary focus is sensing the environment around us through the 5 senses and deciding, is my environment safe or unsafe? And it does this in a split second. And so if the amygdala decides this is a safe environment, then it sends blood flow, oxygen, and control to the wizard brain. And now you're in a highly functioning state. But if the amygdala decides, whoa, unsafe, it sends control to the lizard brain, fight or flight response. The intensity is as if there is a mother bear charging you. When you go into full-blown lizard brain, you basically have been triggered, and now you're in a survival response. So why don't you talk a little bit about what you understand about the neurology and survival response and things like that.
Yeah, I love how you geek out. Did you coin the phrase wizard and lizard brain?
I can't take credit for that, but I saw it somewhere, and if I knew who it was, I'd give them credit.
Yeah, that's pretty good. In addition to the front and back, I love how Jake Porter puts it. You've got the right hemisphere, the right side of the brain, and the left side of the brain. The right side of the brain controls your emotions and physical responses. The left side of the brain is more of the timekeeper. It has the timeline of memories that occur. When the trauma trigger starts, the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain, they're not in sync because the receptors have been damaged from the initial trauma. So what's happening is that betrayed partner is physically reliving that trigger. And based on survival mode, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, based on survival type, will produce different reactions. So I can say for myself, when a trauma trigger occurred, I would become extremely emotional. I would do things that I would never do in a million years. It's not in me. It's not my personality. And it was very jarring and scary for myself to see how I was responding. But that's just part of reliving it. And even though the trauma isn't happening today, the left side of the brain, which is the timekeeper, isn't communicating that to the right side of the brain, saying, you're safe today.
What you describe reminds me of the phenomena that happened in theaters. I think it was about 25, 27 years ago. A movie came out named Saving Private Ryan, and it was a powerful movie. But they practiced the filming of D-Day, in particular, storming of Normandy Beach, with embedded cameras that put the audience in the action as if you're being shot at. And with surround sound, you got bullets whizzing by your head. And it was so realistic and visceral that there was this dynamic happening all across the country in theaters where veterans with PTSD were breaking down, laying in the fetal position, hiding under chairs, having this trauma response because against their will, they were being transported because of that damage between the right and left hemisphere. They're being transported in time to a foxhole from years before. And think about when a betrayed partner is experiencing her own foxhole experience. Imagine if I'm in a movie and a veteran has a response like that. And I don't respond with empathy. I don't respond with care. I don't focus on, he's more important than a movie. I can see this movie anytime. Let's take care of this victim here. Imagine me ridiculing him or blaming him or somehow injuring him while he's in a trauma state. Imagine me saying, what is wrong with you? Are you crazy? What are you doing right now? This is a freaking movie. Get in touch with reality here. You're ruining my movie experience. That would be harsh. That would be cold. That would be calloused. That would be blaming him. And he's a victim against his will of a prior trauma that he experienced to give me the freedom to sit in the freaking theater and watch this movie right now. And instead of gratitude for his fighting for my freedom, I blame him, I harm him, I further injure him in the moment. And that's what many of us unfortunately have done to betrayed partners is she's fighting for the future of the relationship. She's fighting for her healing. And for us to not recognize that this is a victim, that she has been transported in time, she is in a foxhole right now. And the proper thing to do with that veteran or with our partner is to actually join them in the foxhole and just be an empathic witness, to be present, to not leave them and not injure them and not do more harm, but to be a support for them.
There were times, especially early on during my trauma trigger, you didn't show up for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, during the early part of recovery, I'd say the first year, there was a lot of harmful behaviors. And I didn't have the understanding and the language that we have today, but I did not join you in the foxhole. I had professionals I worked with who said things like, is this how you want to live your life, Roy? You want to be with someone like this? She's clearly crazy. I had professionals who said she's pain shopping. I had another professional that said, sounds like she's addicted to trauma. She's got her own addiction. She's addicted to her pain. So I even had professionals that were pathologizing you, and I sadly joined them in that narrative.
Do you remember a specific occurrence?
One of the things you were triggered anytime I would get in the car and I would go somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that you requested, and it was a shame that you even had to request this, you shouldn't have had to request it. If I was focused on your safety, I would have taken the initiative to do it. But you requested for me to share my location
Mm.
on my phone. We didn't have a GPS device yet. So just turn on shared location on my phone so
My
that you would
gosh.
know where I was. It was a simple request that would help provide safety. My response to that was one of frustration, feeling like my freedom is being restricted. This is unfair. So I said something along the lines of, you're going to share your location too, right? Because I don't know where you're going, and you go places, I don't know who you're with, how long you're going to be gone. And then I even tried to disguise, because it was really a control tactic. If you boil it down, that's really what it was. But I tried to
Disguise it as.
disguise it as, I'm concerned about your safety. What if you need help? What if your car breaks down somewhere? I need to find you. But really, if I'm giving up freedom, you need to give us some freedom. If you're going to monitor me, I'm going to monitor you. It was a very selfish, abusive way to handle a triggering moment for you.
So for the guys who are watching, if you're a dad, just try to visualize what I'm about to describe. You're on the playground and there's a body of water, super crowded, tons of little kids running around everywhere. You turn for a split second and your little one is gone. You can't find him or her anywhere. The feelings of panic, fear, and anxiety are crippling. You have shortness of breath. Your heart is racing. Your hands are shaking. Your hands are clammy. You're sweating. You're thinking the worst thoughts possible. And with each passing second, it only gets worse. That is what a trauma trigger feels like. I wish that I could snap my fingers and make it stop when it takes over, but I can't. What I can do is learn safe practices to minimize those trauma triggers and implore Roy to help also create safety guardrails to help me minimize potential triggers. But that's what a trauma trigger feels like. Your body is having a visceral reaction to something that you can't control. Does that paint
That's helpful. Yeah, that's helpful. And that gives a good picture of a trauma trigger and what the experience is like. I think I'd like to take that and compare it to the type of trigger that men often have, and then overlay those two, if I could.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about, because men do experience triggers, and we're not talking about temptations. We're talking about emotional triggers here where they feel overwhelmed. And for the man, it is often related to a core wounding. It's often coming from a place of shame, and it's coming from a core wounding that relates to one of the three I's. So the three I's of shame is either insignificance, incompetence, or impotence. Insignificance is feeling like, do I matter? Competence is feeling like, am I enough? Am I adequate? And impotence is more along the lines of, do I have any control? So if you look at your family of origin or your childhood, especially from age 6 to 16, there is probably some core wounding that took place in one, if not all three of those I's, and that predates your addictive behavior. It created a shame-based belief system that led to distorted ways of thinking where you would act out to soothe that emotion. And so when it comes to guys that are triggered today, often it is around one of those three core woundings. And so their partner will say something or do something that touches one of those sensitive areas, one of the three I's, and they project that shame that they're feeling and that pain onto their partner. They are triggered. They're reminded that self-talk is what they perceive to be echoed by their partner. She sees me as insignificant. She sees me as inadequate or incompetent. She sees me as impotent, as helpless, hopeless. And so when we perceive that our partner is saying or doing something that repeats the self-talk that we already give ourselves, we often are triggered by that. And so when that happens, you've gone into lizard brain. So here's the dynamic. Here's how they relate to each other. It almost creates this trigger loop. If you just visualize a infinity symbol, a loop. She's triggered. She's in lizard brain. She says and does things that she normally would not say and do. As she expresses this pain in this trauma trigger, it causes an emotional trigger for the man, especially in one of the three eyes of shame. And now he's triggered. She's in lizard brain. He's in lizard brain. And let me tell you, nothing helpful is going to come from this conversation. You can't use logic. You can't use rational thought. Neither one of you have executive function in that moment. And so what I often teach my guys that I work with, what I teach them to do in these moments, while we work on rewiring the brain, while we work on addressing the three eyes and dealing with our shame, while we work on emotional regulation so that you can be a safe container for her trigger trauma in those moments that she has, while we work on that, which that's going to take a while, the immediate stopgap that you've got to use is a very specific, structured timeout plan. Because the only thing that will get you out of lizard brain back into wizard brain is TIME. There's no other solution. And it takes at least 20 minutes for you to get regulated, for you to go back to executive function. And so what I give my guys is a very specific timeout plan. The betrayed partner has veto power on it. They have to customize it and make it their own. And it has specific guardrails on things he can and cannot do during timeout, how long it will be, who he will and will not talk to, what he will and will not think about, what he will and will not do, where he will and will not go, and what time is he going to come back, and how is he going to leave the room, and how is he going to re-enter the room. And the warning that I give the men is you must not weaponize this. You don't use a timeout so that you avoid an issue that you don't want to deal with or talk about. The only reason you use a timeout is to protect your partner from you, is to prevent abuse while you learn the skills necessary where you don't need to call a timeout anymore. I haven't needed to call a timeout in several years now, but initially I needed it quite a bit. In fact, sometimes I would need to call a timeout for the same conversation 3, 4, 5 times. If I felt myself going to lizard brain, nothing good's going to come out of this. I need to take a timeout. My MO was I would go for a walk. I would be right here in our neighborhood, but I would just say, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm going to go for a walk. I'll be back in 30 minutes. And then come back and re-engage with my wizard brain the conversation that she needed to have. And I'm ready to be a safe container for your emotions. That's what needs to happen until we learn the skills necessary to be emotionally regulated, to not go into lizard brain, and to be a safe container for our partners. So that loop is happening quite often in the couples that we work with. She's triggered by trauma. He's triggered by her response. She's triggered by events of the past. He's triggered by core wounding from the past that's being retouched on. Both are in lizard brain, and nothing good's going to happen with this conversation. But a lot of damage is done in those moments.
Yes, it is. It's not only the men that can call the timeout.
Good point. Yes.
Also, women. If you see that he is going into behaviors that are of rage or stonewall, or if he's going into any of those survival mode behaviors, yelling, name calling, being aggressive, or maybe he is trying to leave, he is shutting you down, he is not being responsive, he is being very passive or passive aggressive, that's when you can call a timeout because he's not present. And anything that you say at that moment, it's not going to have an impact. So for yourself and to create some really good boundaries and help yourself through those trauma triggers, if he's not showing up to you, call a timeout if you're starting to feel overwhelmed. Call a friend, call one of the sisters in the recovery community. Reach out to someone who can understand. And sometimes just talking about it is really helpful. And when that 20 minutes has passed, you're more emotionally regulated. And hopefully that timeout has allowed him to reflect and say, the way that I'm responding to her is inappropriate. I need to rethink how I'm responding to her.
I thought of a recent trigger that I could give it as an example. We're talking about guys can have emotional triggers. It's not trauma trigger per se. It's not betrayal trauma trigger, but it's a trigger that is often connected to the three eyes. And I actually had one last night.
At dinner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we went on a date last night and we're enjoying sushi and we're actually going over this podcast. And I had written kind of an outline of some thoughts. And so I'm going over it. And as I'm going over it, I felt like you were just picking it apart, that you weren't understanding where I was going with it. We went through like the first 10 lines and each one was just scrutinized and no, that's not going to work, or that could be improved with this or this and that. And it started tapping into the shame core wound of both incompetence and insignificance. She thinks this isn't good enough. She thinks I can't do any right. She thinks she can do it better than me. I'm not feeling understood. And that taps into this insignificant part.
Yeah.
And so in the past, if that had happened, date night would have been a nightmare. I would have gone into a shame spiral. I probably would have reacted in some kind of angry way. And I would somehow do some kind of lashing out towards you. Like, you don't get it, or you're ruining our podcast. Something really horrible that I would have said. But instead, I practiced what I tried to teach the guys to do. And that is, when you experience the three I's, go into the four R's. And so I actually did this last night in the moment. And when you practice this enough, you can get really quick. So very briefly, the four R's. First R, when you realize you're going into shame, that one of the three I's have been touched. The first R is to recognize, okay, this is shame. Which of the three is it? I'm feeling insignificant and I'm feeling incompetent right now. So you recognize it. Second R, reject it. I don't agree with that summary of myself. I don't agree with that perception anymore. That is a lie. That is a false belief. That doesn't come from God. That is an old wound. That's not me anymore. So I reject it. Replacement was something else. The truth is this: Jacqueline's just trying to have a great podcast. She has some wonderful ideas. Some of these concepts that I'm sharing don't make sense to her. She has no ill will towards me. She's not calling me stupid. That's self-talk. She's not saying I'm not good enough. That's self-talk. So I replace it with an alternative thought. And then the fourth R is, what does the relationship need right now? What does the attachment need? And what I needed in that moment, and it was a valid need, I needed a corrective experience for the insignificance and the incompetence that I'm feeling. I need someone to help me feel understood, to help me feel good enough, to help me feel adequate, and validate my ideas. That's what I needed. You can't always go to your partner for that.
And you shouldn't.
And in the early days of recovery, you shouldn't.
Yeah.
You can go to your brotherhood for that.
Absolutely.
That when you go into shame and you recognize the four R's, you recognize what you're experiencing, you reject it, you replace it with healthy self-talk, with an alternative belief. And then what's my relational need behind this? Because when it comes to shame, we are driven by attachments, we are damaged by attachments, and we are healed by attachments. We are wired for relationship. So we came into this world and we needed human connection. That's just the way God made us. But it was in the midst of that human connection that core wounding happened in the first place, usually between age 6 and 16. Those were those core wounds happened. So they happened in attachment. How are they healed? The same way they were created, attachment. Don't rely upon your primary attachment with your partner, men, to heal those wounds in the beginning. That's why you need a brotherhood. You go to them for that. So if it had been a couple of years ago and I'm practicing the four R's and I get to what's the relationship need that I need right now, the attachment need that I have is I need to feel validated. I need to feel understood. I need to feel recognized. So I call a brother. I actually step out of the restaurant and say, I need to make a call right now. I'm feeling a little shame. I call a brother and I rely upon them to give me that validation.
Yeah.
To feel seen, to feel good enough. Those are valid human needs, but I don't need to put that on you.
Right.
If you're still in early recovery, and really in early recovery, it needs to be 90% focused on you and 10% on me. It needs to be 90-10. And that may seem unfair and that may seem unequal, and it is by design. It needs to be that way. Perpetrator, victim. I caused the harm, you receive the harm. If I want to see this coupleship heal, there needs to be a season of disequilibrium in the relationship. I do not need to demand immediate equality in this relationship. I had the locus of control during my compulsive deceptive sexuality. I need to give that locus of control to the victim.
Yep.
That's what she needs in order to experience safety and healing. And I need to voluntarily restrict my freedoms and my rights and my control. And so we have reached a point in our coupleship where I can rely upon you for a lot of my attachment needs. So the way it looked last night was I actually disclosed it to you. I'm feeling a little stunned right now. I'm
Yeah.
feeling a little shame. I don't feel understood. And I feel like you're picking apart what I've written so far. And I put a lot of time and thought into this, and I'm feeling disappointed.
Yeah.
And you were so great in your response. It's exactly what I needed to address that wounding I was feeling. You paused and you said, I did not mean to have that kind of impact on you. I'm so sorry. And you clarified what was really
Yeah.
going on. I did not understand some of the concepts, but it's starting to make sense to me. I think this is a great outline.
Mhm.
My commitment is the same commitment that you have. I want us to really create great content to help couples.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about what could have derailed our entire night,
Mhm.
ended up being about a 30-second hiccup.
Yep.
And then we're attuned again. And we enjoyed a great date night together after that.
Just two things. When we say call a brother or call a sister, call a healthy brother, call a brother
Partner sensitive.
that is obviously partner sensitive,
Yeah.
but is striving to have the type of relationship that you want. If you call someone that doesn't have good, solid recovery, you're only going to create more harm. You call someone not because they're going to tell you what you want to hear, but they're going to tell you what you need to hear. And that's the difference. And the other thing that I said to myself last night as you opened up and you told me you were being vulnerable and how I made you feel, I have this saying in my head and I apply it to our relationship and so many other aspects of my life. People forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And that's a really big quote to apply to your marriage
Mm.
because the impact on how you make your partner feel is the difference between creating resentment, harshness, disassociation, feelings of rejection, or you can have feelings of mutual respect, love, safety, but being vulnerable. So in that moment, I realized my words have impacted him and
Unintentionally.
unintentionally.
There was no ill intent. You did nothing wrong.
Right. But if my apology wasn't sincere and you didn't feel the sincerity in my apology, it wouldn't have been received.
Right. What you did not do is you did not go into defensiveness. What you did do was you clarified there was no ill will.
Right.
I did not mean to impact you this way, but I do own that I did impact you
Yes.
this way. You owned that.
Right.
And a lot of times, if we did nothing wrong, we get defensive. This feels unfair. Your feelings are invalid because I did nothing wrong here.
Right.
So this is really your problem. If I'm walking across the room and I accidentally, wearing boots, step on your toe, did I mean to hurt you? No. But if it breaks your toe and you're crying, you're like, you stepped on my toe. I can say, I did not mean to. And maybe I didn't. There was no intent there. But it doesn't change the fact that there was impact.
Right.
And am I going to own it or not? I broke your toe. You need to own that, whether it was intentional or not. The receiver is hurt. I, as the giver, am I going to own that or not? And you handled it beautifully last
Thank you.
night.
Yeah. And I thank you for being vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I do appreciate the vulnerability because we're very different. If I'm feeling a certain way, I will say it right there in the moment. And maybe not always have a filter, but you are more filtered. You are more about timing and you will bottle things up. And I'm glad that you didn't do that last night and that you just called it out and said, this is how this is impacting me. Because that too would have ruined the evening because you would have been ruminating on the things that you were telling yourself that you thought that I was saying by commenting on the notes that you had come up with.
Yeah. And it could easily have led to resentment. That shame could have
Absolutely.
translated, if you hadn't handled it the way you handled it,
Mm-hmm.
owning the impact and clarifying there was no intent. If you hadn't handled it that way, and I still felt I'm not understood, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
validated, I'm not seen, I'm not recognized, she doesn't acknowledge my effort
Mm-hmm.
and what I put into this, and we're just not on the same page,
Mm-hmm.
we just think differently, and all of these thoughts, I'm more likely to go into resentment towards you, that you touched a core wound, I project that onto you, and now you're the enemy.
Right. And the chances of you being vulnerable with me again, like sharing notes about a podcast
Right.
or whatever,
Because you're not
I'm not safe anymore. Yeah.
So emotional intimacy is into me see, it's being vulnerable, transparent with each other. So we've talked about the fact that triggers are going to be a part of life. They're going to be a part of this journey.
Yeah.
You're going to experience trauma triggers. I'm going to experience emotional triggers. They're going to happen this week.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to happen 5 years from now.
Yeah.
I think they become less frequent as we become more healthy in our coupleship and in our recovery, but they're still going to happen.
One thing I think that is really important that I want to touch on, and I wish I would have touched on it earlier, is when I jotted down those 126 trauma triggers that I had that day. I bet you Rory didn't know about 95% of them,
Oh, yeah.
maybe any.
No clue. No. The frequency or the content of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I relived the infidelity 126 times in one day, and I forgave him every single time. And I think that for the guys, don't take that for granted. Even if she's not voicing them, they are still happening. And she is choosing to forgive you as she works through that. And I think that just embodies unconditional love. And how could you not want to be a safe container, a support, a man of integrity for a woman who is trying so hard and who is really exuding unconditional love? She's hurting. She is working through a variety of emotions all the time, and she chooses to stay in the relationship. How lucky are you? It's the amount of grace that it takes to have 126 triggers and to work through those alone. Oftentimes, we do it alone. No one knows about the thoughts that we're having with all of these different thoughts and riddled with just different emotions and pain. But throughout the day, as those events happen, you choose to forgive over and over and over. And it's easier to forgive when someone can show up for you and be that safe container. It's easier to fight the hard battle and stay in healthy recovery when he is showing up and being the man that you need, that you want, and you deserve. It's like that second wind that we need to get through the difficult times. And I think that is one of the reasons that we are in this place today. I don't think that we would have grown together while we were going through very dark times if there wouldn't have been initiation on your part to think about my needs and make my safety a priority.
It is impactful as I sit here and I remind myself how hard you had to fight to forgive me, to stay in this relationship, the frequency of the triggers, the intensity of the triggers, the loneliness of the triggers, not putting it on me so much of the time. You did put it on me.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. I would hope that I would have fought through that for you. I can't even put myself in those shoes and imagine going through that torment. The word that comes to mind is torment.
Yeah.
That is torment. That is torture. And you endured it, and we made it through it. And it's not like it's all unicorns and Care Bears today. There's still triggers that happen every day.
Yeah.
For you, but it's not every 4 to 8 minutes. They're not as intense, and it's probably easier to forgive.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And I appreciate that you're saying that. And I hope that the men recognize the same and they pay some gratitude to their partner for fighting the hard fight.
Yeah. It's miracle, and I don't throw that word around, but it's a miracle that the typical betrayed partner is not full of resentment, bitterness, and unforgiveness when she has to be reminded that often of the worst thing that's ever happened to her. So thank you for fighting for us.
Yeah. I'm glad I did.
Me too.
So I'll end on this note. As long as she's fighting for the relationship, and that could look a lot of different ways, but she's fighting for the relationship, she cares. Even if it doesn't feel like it, more often than not, that's what's happening.
Well, we want to express our gratitude to you for joining us on this podcast. We'll see you next time. Thanks.
Choose joy.
Bye.